see you.
Thanks for joining us. Okay, so Jacob, let's start with manufacturing. You are of the belief that the United States can once again be a production-based, manufacturing-led economy, and erase the advantage of low-cost labor overseas. Why do you believe that?
Absolutely. So first of all, it's great to be here, and we're having this conversation at such a timely point in time. For most of the 21st century, in the last 25 years, the global economy has been driven by a core set of assumptions that we're seeing the Trump economic revolution and artificial intelligence slowly dismantling. And what I mean by that is, three of those assumptions are the following: that the US economy is primarily a consumption-driven, services-based economy that grows between 1% and 3% per year. The other assumption is that AI was going to lead to mass unemployment and jobs displacement. And the other assumption was this notion that China was on an unstoppable rise to eventually overtake the United States, primarily because of structural advantages in its population and demographics. Part of what we're seeing is leading indicators in a massive reindustrialization in the United States. What are those leading indicators? We're seeing over $1 trillion worth of investments in heavy industrial sectors in the United States. This year, for the first time, investment in AI infrastructure is actually outpacing consumer spending. AI infrastructure investments are actually contributing over a third towards economic growth and GDP. And economic growth and GDP is hitting 3.3% this year, and according to Secretary Lutnick, could potentially hit 4% next year. So we're actually seeing these investments translate to potentially a shift in the growth band of the country from 1% to 3% to potentially 4% and 5%, which would really be a step change in productivity. The last point that I would add is, if we think about why you said that one of the core theses is that AI could potentially erase the labor advantage that developing countries have. And I actually think that's completely true, and that's a fundamental concept. The reason is that AI increases productivity. So if we look back in history during the first industrial revolution, Britain, the industrial output per capita of Britain during the first industrial revolution in 1913 was 65 times higher than industrial output per capita in China. And the reason is simple. It was all about tech. Britain had superior tech. It was able to completely outproduce China at the time.
But Jacob, how realistically is the United States going to overcome high infrastructure costs, high labor costs, talent gaps, and disruptive tariffs?
You're already seeing that. I think the answer is actually being played out in real time. I mean, over $1 trillion a year in infrastructure investments is showing that the productivity gains far outweigh the costs of these investments. We're seeing demand for energy. Demand for energy and electricity production was flat in this country basically between last year and 2008. And for the first time in a generation, it's actually moving up, which is a good sign because it means that our economy is becoming more energy dense, because we're now seeing an expansion in industrial activity and because these AI factories need a lot of energy. So it's, people could theorize different reasons for why this is taking place, but it's hard to deny the fact that it is taking place.
I want to get your thoughts on this since you are advising the White House on economic policy. The Trump administration has just decided to take a direct stake in Intel. Do you view this as the start of a permanent U.S. industrial strategy, or is this just a one-off fix for a company that was struggling?
Look, the U.S. government was obviously, took a pretty unique step in providing very large financial advancements to a number of companies in the last administration. I think of the Trump approach to boosting industrial activity here through 4 prongs: taxes, trade, deregulation, and energy. Those 4 prongs are fundamentally what's driving industrial activity in the US. Deregulation means dramatically compressing the windows for permitting and NEPA reform, which was included in the One Big Beautiful Bill. Taxes is a huge driver. So the One Big Beautiful Bill actually has full expensing for capital investments, intensive capital investments, which is actually changing the economics of investments, since you brought up costs. Energy, the president reopened ANWR. He set very ambitious targets for nuclear energy production, which is direly needed in this country because we need to dramatically expand our energy supply. So, and trade, for the first time in over a generation, we're actually starting to rebalance our trading relationships with partners. And I think it's quite unprecedented that we've had an administration that's basically concluded over a dozen trade deals with our major trading partners in less than a year. So usually people spend almost 4 years to get a single trade deal done, and we're up to almost 12 now.
What about this idea of imposing tariffs on semiconductors for companies that are not relocating back to the US? How does that work practically? Is that a good idea in your view?
So I'm not going to comment on the specific breakdown of the application of tariffs, but what I will say is, because it sounds like you're referring to tariffs applied to semiconductors coming from Taiwan. From memory, negotiations with Taiwan are still ongoing, so I'm not going to prejudge what the outcome of those negotiations will be. But what I will say is, fundamentally, the administration is basically building the rails for a new trading system. The United States was running a $1 trillion trading deficit with our top 12 trading partners every single year. That is not a sustainable place for us to be, and it's actually bad for our fiscal deficit and our long-term growth. And so tackling that issue, I think, was an economic security issue, and that's exactly what they're doing. And we are seeing real benefits. I mean, the US is on course to bring in $300 billion this year alone to the Treasury to pay down the deficit. And the CBO estimated that we could bring in up to $4 trillion over 10 years, which completely changes the fiscal outlook for this country.
Another unprecedented move by the Trump administration has been taking a cut of NVIDIA chip sales to China. What message does that send, given that China is viewed as the largest national security threat to both China and US companies?
Well, and I'm sure you saw the Chinese government basically opened an investigation to probe whether or not they wanted to block those imports now. Look, there is a really big debate going on what the right balance is between national security concerns that aim at protecting our most valuable intellectual property and the tension of competing for market share internationally.
Where do you land on that debate?
It's a really, there's classified information that I haven't yet been privy to, as I await a floor vote for my incoming role, but fundamentally, here's what the tension is. There's some people in the camp that basically say that China's production capacity is narrowing the gap and could potentially catch up to us and eventually fill the void in global demand. And those who basically argue that they're actually quite far behind. It's hard to really know exactly because China's a very opaque system. There is classified information somewhere in the US government, which again, I haven't closely studied, but at the end of the day, there's a really big meta level question as to whether we assume that we can continue leading the world technologically if we don't also dominate in market share. There is a value in market share, and so striking that balance is incredibly important because we need to protect our technological lead while also making sure that our trusted partners have access to the American stack.
Jacob, you advised the president on TikTok, and I would love to know just, did you see it playing out this way?
Well, I did not advise the president on TikTok. I was involved in deliberations in Congress and conversations in Congress. Obviously, we wouldn't be talking about this issue had it not been for President Trump's efforts in his first term. At the end of the day, my view is no president has done more to align our economic policy with our national security imperatives than President Trump. Our biggest economic security risk is our industrial over-reliance with China. Ultimately, right now, the administration has pursued an aggressive diplomacy with the Chinese government to have a holistic conversation about what the shape of a new trading regime is with China, which actually includes the tech component of it, including TikTok. And so it would be premature for me to prejudge the outcome of those negotiations, but I think it's fair to say that we have an incredibly strong champion in the president.
If there is a deal where China continues to control the algorithm, will that satisfy you?
So I'm not going to prejudge the outcome. I think that's a hypothetical, and I'm just not going to prejudge the outcome of those discussions.
Okay, so moving on to the workforce, you have flagged that we are at risk of falling behind on AI. But what policies should the government be responsible for to ensure that displaced workers do have a path forward?
Look, our number one opportunity with AI is productivity. And here's why. There is a macroeconomic theory called Jevons paradox, which basically says that efficiency drives demand. When the use of a commodity or a resource becomes more efficient, demand for that commodity and resource goes up, not down. So if labor becomes much, much more efficient, demand for labor will go up. An interesting fact is that in 2018, 60% of the jobs in 2018 didn't exist at all in 1940. And so if you went back in 1940 and told bookkeepers and receptionists that in the 80s you'd have the personal computer revolution, I'm sure a lot of them would actually say that a lot of jobs would be lost and that the computer was going to lead to mass job losses. What we've actually seen since the computer revolution, between 1980 and 2015, is the destruction of 3.5 million jobs versus the creation of over 19 million jobs.
But in that transition, people are displaced, right? Does the government have a role to play there?
You tell me, what role did the government play during the personal computer revolution? I think the notion that the government necessarily has to hold the hands of every single person getting displaced actually underestimates the resourcefulness of people. If you think about the computer revolution, you had the software revolution that came out of that. You had enormous wealth. Our biggest companies as a country are basically mostly software companies. And so I think that the top-down approach, where we assume that the government has to have the answer to everything, actually underestimates the incredible adaptability and resourcefulness of the private sector.
Jacob Helberg, thank you so much.